Our guest speaker tonight probably needs no introduction to many of you, and certainly her name is well known to all of you, namely the Honourable Dr. Jane Lomax-Smith. She's had a number of prominent public roles in South Australia. Her background is in medicine, and she did a PhD in medicine at Adelaide Uni in 1986, graduating in 1986. She served as Lord Mayor of Adelaide from 1997 until 2000. She entered politics in 2002 as the member for Adelaide in the House of Assembly. She was a minister in the Rand government and variously held portfolios for the City of Adelaide, education, mental health and substance abuse and tourism. Her presentation tonight is entitled Forged in the Great War, the Adelaide-Dernancourt Connection. Thank you, Jane.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, can I thank you for inviting me here today. It's something of an honour because, of course, I'm not a historian and have no professional skills in this area, but I stumbled across what can only be described as a peculiar relationship and was so fascinated by it I was driven to speak to all the real archivists and historians I could find in town to uncover the background of what was really happening between Dernancourt and Adelaide. And I think I've found a story that is worth telling. So can I firstly acknowledge we meet on Ghana land and tell you how I discovered that there was indeed a Dernancourt. We all know that there's a place called Dernancourt in the suburbs of Adelaide, but so few of us know that it's named after a town in the Somme. I should say a village. If you've been there, you wouldn't really call it a town. I had heard nothing of this place until the Premier of South Australia, Mike Rann, went to Paris on one of those trade missions. And as always happens, you have to have a visit to the local ambassador who gives you a talk about tons of this, gallons of this, volumes of something else and people going here and there. And it's a lot of technical stuff, but a lot of political and social events in the place as well. And the Australian ambassador in Paris started the conversation with Mike Rann by asking what he wanted to do about Dernancourt. Well, I think he was somewhat confused because he'd never thought about Dernancourt. Well, perhaps that's an overestimate of his indifference to the place, but most people wouldn't go to Paris and consider Dernancourt. And it turned out that she wanted to know because there was a man in Dernancourt who was obsessed with Adelaide and South Australia. And this gentleman here, Monsieur Lionel Lamotte, had been writing letters, telephoning, and generally driving the ambassador from Australia crazy for about 30 years. He'd been organising Anzac Day ceremonies in this village, and he spent most of his time trying to get people from South Australia. If he could find a visiting contingent of Australian soldiers, he would lure them to the ceremony by the War Memorial. And he would hold this ceremony, I later discovered, because his father and his grandfather had said this relationship was important. Eventually, Monsieur Lamotte succeeded in getting this chap out to Dernancourt. And that's John Howard, and he was not amused. He didn't want John Howard, he wanted a South Australian. And so it was decided, and I don't want to break cabinet confidentiality, but the Premier came back and said, who speaks French? And guess what? There was only one person in cabinet who could speak French. So I was sent to the 90th anniversary of the Battle of the Somme. And that started on the first day of July, and it was 6 weeks before, and I tried as hard as I could to find out why I was going to Dernancourt. I was quite excited. I got to sing the Marseillaise, and I laid wreaths, and I gave several speeches in French. But I have to say I'd found it very difficult to find anybody who knew anything about Dernancourt. Put it in perspective, for those of you with a history knowledge, the Western Front goes down here and moved back and forth. Fairly early on in the war, Albert was taken by the Germans. The landmarks are Amiens, and the coast is up here and Paris is down here. Dernancourt is about 10k from Albert. So the line went through Beuzicourt, Milancourt, Dernancourt, Morlancourt, and down to Le Hamel. So the whole area was on the Western Front. I was sent with a member of the opposition who was wonderful company, I have to say. David Ridgway and I had a marvellous experience, and we both learned a great deal. And as soon as I got to Dernancourt, I knew why I was there. There was absolutely no doubt about it. You see the school? It says Pavilion Adelaide. And immediately I knew that I was in the right place. It was quite a moving experience. I've never been anywhere in the world where you walk into a schoolroom and they have a map of Adelaide, a picture of Victoria Square, a few kangaroos and possums and things, and even a rather bleak, I was embarrassed to admit it, bleak shot of Dernancourt. The whole experience was extraordinary, and I think that Monsieur Lamotte was happy. He laid on a concert where they sang war songs and there were speeches, and that was the night before the official start of the memorial service in 2006. We laid wreaths, and there is my friend Monsieur Lamotte again, right in the middle of it all. Local government members, councillors wear those sashes. We had meetings in the street, we had marches, and it was a wonderful experience. But as I said, I'd had trouble finding out what it was all about. And I really struggled before I left Australia, and nearly all the information I could get, I got afterwards. You probably know Dernancourt's diorama. If you've ever been to the Australian War Memorial, the biggest diorama in display is of Dernancourt. It says Dernancourt 1918. You've probably never noticed it because it's just there, but it's huge, and I recommend that you see it when you next go. The point about the battle was it began on the 1st of July 1916. The British Army suffered enormous losses, and towns like Dernancourt were eventually wiped out, I discovered, by the end of the war. And the only photograph or information I got was this one. That's the village of Dernancourt. When you go now, the school and the church are here. You walk along this street, you drop a few memorial wreaths on the war memorial here, you walk up, you go under the railway viaduct, and this little area is the cemetery. And this architecture is easy to pick, or geography, the line of the railway line, the village and the cemetery. And the reason the Germans wanted particularly to reach the line was to cut off the supply line. And it was an important supply line that had to be broken. The actual Battle of Dernancourt was right at the end of the war in March. And there were several brigades lying around Dernancourt, and many of the battalions were predominantly South Australian. And the story that Monsieur Lamotte told, and the one that stuck in my mind, was that the Australians were billeted there from the beginning of the war. If you go to the War Memorial, you can get the names on a list of the Frenchmen and the French families who billeted Australian soldiers. It's easy to find. It's quite moving. And while they were billeted there, they slept sometimes in the village and sometimes they were fighting in the trenches, and they went backwards and forwards. So they would spend some time in the trenches, they'd go back to Dernancourt, and they would help the women on the farms. And they were mainly farm boys, and the locals loved the Australians because they were practical, they could help with the horses, they could help plough fields, they would help repair things that were broken, and they were just generally useful country boys. And that was why the Australians were absolutely loved by the French. And this is just the only thing I found before I went. And this is from Bean, of course, and it's talking about the night of the Battle of Dernancourt, and the 48th Battalion sector laid along the straight stretch of track, that's the rail line, from Albert Amiens Road, and they came to it in the dark. And this is the story that was told by Captain George Mitchell. He said, "Darkness came down, and with the fading light, the enemy's shell fire died away. From the bank we moved forward by sunken roadways to the railway. Many hundreds of yards we went in the moonlight. At last we reached our sector, where the line formed a high bank. Small niches were cut in it. The garrison lined the top, and the men we relieved were the 9th Royal Scots and the King's Own Scottish Borderers. They asked, 'Who are you?' We told them 48th Australians. 'Thank God,' they said, 'you will hold him.'" It's a very moving sense that the Australians were well respected and loved by all those that were involved. As I said, I arrived with no knowledge, but I was not to be disappointed. Everybody in Dernancourt knows the story, and they all want to tell you. And I was actually given a student project, which was quite charming because it told the story of what was happening from their point of view. The student story, whereby they said the village before the war had 342 people living in it. They were mainly farm labourers and farmers, and they predominantly worked locally, but 10% of the village had to work in Albert. There was no transport, and the only way they could get there was to walk, leaving home at 5 in the morning. So this was fascinating for the children. And that, of course, is the bridge, the viaduct, which was to be tackled by the Germans and taking the town. The village had a substantial church, which was well loved. And if I can just ask you to remember in your mind the roof line, I'll show you another photograph of this in a moment. The church, which was used as a hospital. There were many English and Australian soldiers. The most badly wounded were cared for in our church, and they died and were interred in the cemetery. And the cemetery, which had been a small domestic cemetery, got larger and larger, as you'd imagine. And as the cemetery expanded, the bodies were put along the edge of the cemetery. Just to prove there were Australians in Dernancourt, it's dated the 13th of December 1916. It's postmarked Dernancourt. It says, "My dear Jess, just a card to let you know that things are well here. I've joined up with Matt last Saturday. We're camped in a billet at," there's a line, we're not allowed to write Dernancourt. "I've met Les, and Les is in the hospital with influenza. Father and I went to see him, but he was in bed, but seemed quite cheerful. He got a surprise to see us. He looks reasonably well and told us lots of stories about being on the Somme, love," and I can't read the signature. So there were really Australians there. But the people carried on living while they were the men were fighting in the trenches, coming and going. Various buildings were damaged, but the place was habitable until the Battle of Dernancourt. And that was an absolutely decimating experience. I showed you the railway line, and I think the bridge must have been in there somewhere. The whole place was flattened. The village was wiped out. The church was destroyed, the village was destroyed, and very little was left. Eventually, after the end of the war, the people returned, and they found their home was significantly destroyed. The trains finally got across the bridge, but you can see there's not a tree in sight. And if you could see these pictures, these are children in rags. And in the original, the Frenchman told me these children are wearing Australian cut-down trousers, Australian soldiers' trousers. And they're a ragged lot, but they moved back into the town and tried to sort the place out. They built what you and I would probably call a Nissen hut, or a sort of huts that we might build under these circumstances. And the first one they rebuilt was a church. And governments being what they are, they wanted to tell people what to do. And this is a charming poster which says, "Wash your hands before you eat, put baby out in the fresh air, keep the chickens well fed." This one is, "Don't let the chickens poo in the well, you'll get an infection. Shut the window, the flies will come in and spread disease." And the last one says, "If you feel ill, have a good sleep." Not entirely bad advice. And then, of course, there were over 300 bodies buried in this cemetery. And what happened after the war was that there were rough crosses. The War Grave Commission came and made a political or moral decision that men would be equal in death. So every grave, whether you were a major or a private or whatever you were, had to look exactly the same, and that was an active decision. This is the handwritten account by the students. And they say at the end, in French, at the end of the war, Dernancourt was adopted by the town of Adelaide in Australia. And things were sent, and it was decided that when the money was distributed, the clothes were distributed, the sweets were distributed, after that, a durable monument would be built to remind people of the kindness of Australia and South Australia and Adelaide. And what they did in the 1920s was build that school, Adelaide Pavilion. Interestingly enough, and I have to come back and read it, they said, and this is the strangest part of all, and what really worried me, they said, Madame Mouchette, the widow of an Australian soldier, died at Dernancourt, and she organised a big gala on a packet boat. And I have to say, I thought that the Frenchmen were crazy. I did not believe that anyone in Adelaide was called Madame Mouchette. And I did not believe that anybody called Madame Mouchette had raised the money. And I got this photograph, which is interesting because before the Imperial War Graves Commission started, people would rush off to France and intern their relatives in a posh sort of grave. You obviously had to be relatively well off to do that. And so there are 5 graves in Dernancourt Cemetery, which are different from the war graves. This was a family that lost a lot of brothers and is well known. And when we do the ceremonies in Dernancourt, the mayor always goes to this man's grave and specifically lays a wreath of flowers on it. And there's something about this man that I can't quite get to the bottom of. They regarded him as a great leader and a great soldier, and they hold him in great respect. Now, there's this photograph of this woman, and I had no idea who she was, and she seems very young to be Madame Mouchette, to be honest, but it wasn't entirely apparent. But what happened between 1922 and 1925 is money came from Adelaide, boxes came from Adelaide, and they eventually decided to have an Adelaide Day celebration to thank us. And you can see the children are beautifully dressed. They're all in gorgeous clothes. And they march down the street, everybody dressed up, and you can just see at the top left, Le Jour d'Adelaide. This was Adelaide Day, a fete to thank the Australians. And there were speeches and there were parades, and they opened their new school, Pavilion Adelaide, which is still there. And you can see they're all well dressed. Now they are the clothes of your grandparents, because the clothes are different between the end of the war and now. They had no money, they were poor. They were packages and boxes of clothes coming from Adelaide. This is the school now, and those children are sitting in our building. And that's the town hall that was built at the same time, all with our money invested. The present-day Dernancourt, and there's dear Monsieur Lamotte, is now thriving, and to some extent it could have been the end of it all. We included in the annual Premier Spirit of Anzac tour, where half a dozen children go to the Somme every year to find their forebears and go through the fields to work out where their relatives died and where they were buried. I decided that I'd invite Monsieur Lamotte because I thought, goodness me, he deserved something for all this. So I invited him to Adelaide for Anzac Day. It was deeply moving. He gave speeches everywhere and said how grateful he was to Adelaide. He usually ended up crying, and so did the audience. That's Graham Nybo, Vice President of the RSL. He sat on the dais with the dignitaries on Anzac Day, and gosh, it bucketed. And he went to my favourite RSL, which is in Walkerville, and they laid on a French Day for him with French flags, French music, and he had the Marseillaise played at the War Memorial in Walkerville. I'll tell you why Walkerville in a moment. Walkerville is very important. And I suppose that could have been the end. I could have stopped, but I have to say it played on my mind. How could we be so forgetful? How could we be so negligent? How could we know so little? Surely someone in Adelaide knew something. Well, of course, I didn't know anything, but I had friends in wonderful places who were historians and could use the internet and dredge up facts. And I kept thinking, who are these children? Look at their clothes. They're our clothes. And this was the fete, Adelaide Day, when they were celebrating. And those clothes, I'm sure, come from here. So the first question was, who was Madame Mouchette? And I have to say I was pretty sceptical about Madame Mouchette. What I can tell you is that 6 weeks before Monsieur Lamotte arrived, I went to the Queen Adelaide Club, who were launching their centenary book, The History of the Queen Adelaide Club. And I bought it immediately and sat up in bed that night and read it, and you'll never guess what. Madame Mouchette, Bertha Mouchette, was a foundation member of the Queen Adelaide Club in 1909, which got me going. I thought, well, this is it. I've got to find out about this woman. And indeed, the children were wrong. She was not the widow of an Australian soldier. She was born in 1846. She'd exhibited in the Paris Salon. She'd moved to Melbourne with her sister, who was called Marie Lyon, and she was an author. She was a painter, and not only had she exhibited at the Paris Salon, she ran an art school in Melbourne. Not only did she do that, but she taught Margaret Preston to paint. She ran a school for ladies. She founded the Alliance Française in Melbourne and moved to Adelaide, where she did the same thing. She was involved with the Theosophical Society, and she was absolutely irrepressible. Of course, she's much older than the lady with the fox fur coat that the French talk about, who clearly was not Madame Mouchette. Madame Mouchette was quite elderly in many ways. She was 72 in 1918 when she started the campaign. And I found one painting in Adelaide only. She was actually a governess for the Hawkers, and there must be something here. There must be a painting here but someone has seen or knows about Madame Huchette. It's unthinkable there'd be nothing in Adelaide. Someone must have one. This is from the Theosophical Society, and it's Annie Besson, and she was one of the founders of the Theosophical Society. She has an emblem on her necklace, which is a Freemason's emblem, and that's the only one I can find in Adelaide. She raised the funds, and if you go through the archives, and the Adelaide City Council were very helpful in showing me that their archives, and Lynn found some archives from Walkerville, and the names are like the who's who of Adelaide. Mrs. Hawker, Mrs. Darrenberg, Mrs. Rymore, they were all involved. At Walkerville they took 50 badges to sell. Mrs. Darrenberg forced them to. And everybody was involved in the fundraising, but it all began at a meeting of the Société d'Assistance Maternelle et Infantile. I mean, tell me that's not a French woman. At the Adelaide Town Hall in October 1920. It took a while to get going, but that was because it became competitive. The English had started twinning. They had it in Sydney, they had it in Melbourne, and they couldn't bear not to have a town in Adelaide. And that's why there was a push to have an Adelaide sister city relationship. The two French women, Berthe Mouchette and Marie Lyon, were the prime movers, and everyone was enthusiastic. Now, it's very embarrassing to be in Adelaide because everybody's related, but I have to say the Lord Mayor wasn't very enthusiastic. And I don't know if anyone knows or is related to the Maldens, but I have to say he was less enthusiastic than he might have been. He even said he wanted to look into it. He wanted to know what the responsibilities were. He wanted to know what it meant, and the Lady Mayoress will find it quite impossible to give any time to it. She has already entered many engagements which will occupy her fully for many months, basically go away. And Mr. Malden was an interesting man. The irony of this all was that, of course, he was rejected for active service in the war, and he actually was honoured by the French for his services, but you have to say he was pretty unwilling. You don't get a sense that this is a man who is at all enthusiastic. But the person who clearly was involved, and the one of all this saga that I'm really quite attracted to, is his wife. His wife, who he said couldn't be involved, was a sort of woman who would not have taken no for an answer. This woman is Lady Deborah Vernon Hackett, and you may not have heard of her. She was born in 1887, and she is the most wonderful woman. I just feel inspired by her. Her father was Frederick Slade Drake Brockman in Perth. They were pretty well connected. She went to Guildford Grammar School for boys. Isn't that wonderful? She was willful, she was unusual, she was an individualist, she explored caves, she went riding, and she spoke to Aboriginals. They were a good-looking family, and she had a most pleasing delicacy of feature and blue eyes. She's certainly gorgeous. And at the age of 18, she married an Irishman 40 years older than her, who the family disapproved of enormously. He was called Sir John Winthrop Hackett. And he was a great benefactor of the university in Western Australia. They had 5 children, 4 girls, who were as willful as their mother, and a son. One of the girls was thrown out of Adelaide University because she sat her sister's Latin exam. I tell you, these girls had bad genes. But one of the brothers became Chief of the British Army on the Rhine and Principal of King's College, University of London. So we're talking about an inspiring family. Anyway, husband number 1 died. She was left with 5 children. It didn't hold her back. She went skiing in Kosciuszko and met Malden. And Bay, as he was called, I can't get a sense of him. He doesn't seem the right sort of person for her somehow. Anyway, she married him. She brought all the children over here, and they all did wonderful things. And just to follow on the story, he eventually died, and she finally managed to marry someone 9 years younger than her. She was beginning to learn. And she married someone called Buller, Buller Murphy, and she became Dr. Buller Murphy because she was given an honorary degree, and she decided that it was better to be a doctor than a lady. And she died in 1965, aged 78, after she'd been involved in the mining industry and geology, travelled to America, set up mines and been in business. She sounds a truly wonderful woman. So she was one of the quite fascinating women who were involved in the fundraising. I should say that the story of the packet boat wasn't entirely a fiction, and I'll get back to that in a moment. Now, who is this woman with the fox fur that the Frenchmen keep going on about? They talk about a lonely Australian woman who used to go to the graves every few years and comfort. She looks rather sad. Well, the nearest we have found, and it's not me, it's the people who are good at this sort of stuff, is that this woman is a woman called Marcel Dutigny. And the photograph, if you saw the originals, are very similar. And how did that come about? Well, she was in a concert with Jack Fuster, and she was performing at the ball that was put on by Mrs. Rymel. And the photographs match, which may be just enough to hold it all together. But she wasn't the only one visiting these graves. You had a talk earlier this year about Sir Henry Barwell. He visited Dernancourt and carried gifts, money and boxes with him on a trip to Europe. In addition, currently in the modern era, all the governors have been going now because we've rekindled the relationship. So Marjorie Jackson Nelson, Kevin Scarce. And interestingly, buried in the back of all this, there's a story about Roma Mitchell going. She went on a private visit. Nobody knew what she was doing, but she wanted to go to Dernancourt. And the reason for that was that her father died in the Battle of Dernancourt. So there were many linkages about this place. So how did Bertha manage to get the money and the boxes and everything there? In 1922, her sister died, and died in Rose Park, so she must be buried somewhere around here. She wrote several novels in English and French, and at the age of 76, Bertha decided to go back to France to end her days. And she took money, she took clothes, she took food, sweets, and all sorts of stuff. And she went on a boat called the Narkunda and stopped in Bombay. And when she landed in Bombay, she was landing at the same time as Nellie Melba. Not to be held back, she managed to get Nellie Melba to run a fundraising concert. She was irrepressible, and she managed to talk Mr. Charles Workness of the D'Oyly Carte company as well into performing, and she raised another £100 and then set off for France. So she delivered all her packages, and then she went off and died 3 or 4 years later in France, and that was the end of her connection with Australia. Now, why do we have Dernancourt in South Australia? And that's another story that sort of worried me, because if you go to Dernancourt, it doesn't look as if it was built around the First World War when these emotions were strong. And Lynn, I think, lives next door to Chester Hobby, the family historian of the Hobby family, and he knew something of Leslie Hobby. Now, Leslie was in the 27th Infantry Battalion. And looking at the only information that Dernancourt had, because they don't have anything out there, this was a little story in one of the manuals they had at the school, and it talks about the battle, and it says in a rather bland way there was a Victoria Cross, a military medal, 5 military medals, a few military crosses, and it talks about all the things that happened at Dernancourt, but it doesn't say why it's called Dernancourt. And the reason it was called Dernancourt, that was its subdivisions in the 20s, was that this is Leslie Hobby, and this is a recommendation or a congratulations for his military medal. He was in the 27th, and his relatives, a cousin who knew about this service, decided to call the subdivision Dernancourt. He was in the 27th Battalion, and before I forget, the other person in the 27th Battalion who was there at the same time was, believe it or not, Thomas Playford. So we have a story that now links in some extraordinary people. We've got Dame Roma, we've got Bertha Mouchette, who really exists and is very famous. Now I've discovered, if you speak to the Alliance Française, she's revered. Marie-Léon, the author, the Henry Barwell, who actually visited the place, the first premier to go there, Thomas Playford, who fought there, Nellie Melba, who raised money, Lady Hackett, who was very exciting, I think. The Queen Adelaide Club were the lead to whom Madame Mouchette was, and of course the Alliance Française. So it's an extraordinary tale that links in with the history of Adelaide in a marvellous way. Of course, I had no capacity to dig up any of this. The only thing that I did that was useful was buy the Queen Adelaide Club's 100th centenary book. I should acknowledge Monsieur Lamotte, who is tenacious, very tenacious. Lynn O'Grady from the Walkerville Historical Society, Catherine Bullen, who's a historian from the Queen Adelaide Club, Jenny Maloney from National Gallery of Victoria, who found the photograph, and Michael Farrow, and I'm sorry, that is the spelling, who's from the Adelaide City Council and dredged out all the letters. And some of them weren't very nice letters. A lot of the people were saying, we don't want to give money away, we fought the war, that's all they deserve. But it was an interesting series. It helped us fill in the gaps. And if I can encourage you to do anything, do visit the Somme. I know everyone wants to go to Anzac Cove, but this is a beautiful place with much nicer food. And apart from anything else, you have Amiens Cathedral, which is a medieval masterpiece, Château de Chantilly, which is has one of the largest art collections in France, and there is a river system, a canal system, like kind of mini Venice in Amiens. It is a very beautiful place to visit. Of course, it's also terribly serious. And I don't think Australians can fail to be moved when you go there. Whether or not you have relatives who fought in the war, you always see these poppies. And remember that poem. In Flinders Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row. But mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing, fly scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw the torch, be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. And I just finish with a painting by Bertha Mouchette. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane, for quite a remarkable story, I've got to say. And I loved your comment about research and persistence. The more you dig, the more you find. Yes. That poem, by the way, I can't remember the author's name. Cray, that's right. Dr. McCrae. He was a Canadian medico, and he wrote that the day before he was killed, I think. Yeah.
Not a question, but a comment. I have 200 World War I items of memorabilia, which is letters, postcards and photos. I'm certain some of the postcards are from Albert. I have photos and postcards between 4 French soldiers and the families, and from the families to the 4 French soldiers. In addition to that, I have postcards and photos from the families to captured German prisoners of war. On these French cards and photos, I don't understand French, but you might be interested to have a look at them.
Thanks, Ken.
And I suspect that if I were asked to do this speech again in about 4 years' time, it will be quite different, because I'd know. I mean, that woman with the fox fur bothers me. And there are lots of things that bother me that I can't quite pin down, but the information's there, you've just got to be clever enough to uncover it.
I was wondering about the Christian names of the Malden. I've got a photograph album at home. My grandfather's, Hales, a stepsister was married in the Maldens Belchers. There was one of them that was a photographer, and I wondered what the Christian names were, if you knew.
Well, this Malden was a lawyer, and Frank Beaumont Malden, and they used to call him Bay, B-A-Y, it's sort of nickname.
I don't think it's the same.
Sorry? I understand he was called Beaumont.
Yes. And when was Dernancourt Adelaide named? Before the war?
No, way after the war, about 1970.
Because of
it appears that at the time there was a lot of information in the newspaper. The register was quite hot on helping the fundraising. But the fact that this gentleman had a relative who was at Dernancourt, had got a military medal, and had survived, as I understand, was a very important one. But Lynn knows more about probably than I do.
Back to the names, Frank Beaumont was the son of Beaumont Arnold Malden, and his Beaumont Arnold's brother was Bayfield, and he was known as Bay. Frank was known as Frank, and he was my father's cousin. I don't know, I never met him. He was dead before I was born.
Come back from a ski holiday with a wife and 5 children. I just think he was quite brave to have done that, especially as she was so flighty.
I know a little bit about Deborah Maldon. John Playford used to keep saying, you ought to be writing about her. She married 3 Lord Mayors. She owned a beryl mine that was taken away from her by the government during the war. She used to walk around in tramp clothes, I believe, so that no one would recognise her in the city of Adelaide when she was Lady Mayoress. Don't remember you doing that. And I think she had a lot to do with Girl Guides too. Yes. Yeah, something like that. And of course, she was the mother of the very famous Pat Hackett of the Torch Theatre. But a book could be done of Deborah Maldon. Yeah, she was the one who threw the ink over Max Harris. Yeah.
I'm just curious as to maybe why the relationship between Dernancourt and Adelaide has perhaps broken down, or the awareness of it perhaps was forgotten after all those years, or over all those years.
2 people might love each other one week and one of them gets a bit cold. Have you ever had someone come up to you and say, thank you, in 1984 you did something and it changed my life? And you think, what did I do? And sometimes people say, I remember when we were children we used to play together, and you think, I don't even know who you are. And that kind of experience about the asymmetry of our relationships I think is very similar here, because it's almost as if, we've just forgotten. They can't forget. Every time they walk down the street there's Rue d'Australie, Pavilion Adelaide, and people must say, why does it say Pavilion Adelaide? And it's folklore. And one of the wonderful stories in this archive that I didn't quite talk about was a man called Samuel Lunn, who I don't know much about. He was apparently a very active fundraiser. He went and took packages of stuff to Dernancourt. And apparently the children ran along the street saying, Australien, Australien. And he met the mayor, and he gives this description of how moving it was to meet the mayor because he was wearing moleskin trousers. And both of them served in France in the First World War, and they talked about it. So I have that memory, and one can imagine this whole village that was steeped in this story. People don't move so much from these villages. They've been there for generations. They would be, it would be something that they'd know about. But, we've got other things to worry about. Bigger town.
The French village of Dernancourt has so much more to hold on to than we have in Australia. I mean, the fact that we did so much for them is very different than what we have out here to look back to for France. There's not the same sort of relationship.
But I think it's very interesting for us to learn that. I found it a very rewarding experience. One of the peculiar experiences I had was, you knew that this was a small village that couldn't get many visitors from overseas. When the schoolmaster gives the visiting dignitary a gift like this, handmade by himself. Not many international travellers can carry that home. It's very heavy. But you can see it's tended with coffee.
Oh, of course.
This is a very rural area. It's quite charming. It doesn't even have a pub. It's so usual for a small village. But if you go, Albert has all the facilities, and Chantilly is the street. It's a lovely area.
Some of you, when you heard the topic tonight, might have had a distant memory. About 15 years ago in the Journal, when I was editing it, we had a story about the campaign to raise money for Dernancourt. So I'll refer that to you, because those French women appear in it. There's a whole lot of material. Obviously we weren't digitised then because it didn't come up on the Google, but certainly somebody in Adelaide, and I can't remember because I haven't checked it yet, wrote that piece, and because I published it I can remember it, and some of you may have a distant memory. Yeah.
There's a second-hand dealer on Goodwood Road, just short of McDonald's Crossroad, and he specialises in those badges. Almost certainly you'll have that amongst many hundreds of fundraising badges that were used at that time. All of the charities, when they had the rights by the City Council to stand at certain corners, what you got was a badge, and you put your money in, of course, in the usual way. And they're all quite interesting. But yeah, I can't remember his name. Felicia, that's the place. Yeah, Felicia. and he has trays and trays and trays of them.
I'd just like to say Dr. Brian Dickey will receive your paper at the end so that we can publish this. This will help to make sure the story's not forgotten. So if you want a little help, you know, sort of what we call sexing up your paper, it's a lovely story, and we do need it for the journal, and it will help you too. So, well, you know, for your next story that you might want to research him, but we'll help you to publish it.
I think historians have got an element of relating stories regardless of whether you see yourself as an official researcher, Jane. Well, I've got to say that's been an amazing story. I love stories that work that way, and you've still got enough questions there to keep you going, apart from collecting things. And one comment you made brought something back to my mind which I'd forgotten from my childhood. My grandfather served on the Western Front, and on the mantelpiece in the house at Turret Gardens was a photograph of a French lady and 2 young children. And it's very vague, we've still got the photograph, but I remember asking my grandfather, who are these people? And he said, oh, that's Madame so-and-so, I don't remember the name. And they were the people who billeted him when he was on the Western Front. And he kept in contact with them right through until her death in the early 1950s. He never actually went back to Europe to see them, but they corresponded.